back of the line." The words came before he had even reached the counter, before he had opened his mouth, before the gate agent had looked up from her screen. 2 syllables delivered like a door being shut in someone's face, flat and final and completely certain of itself. Dr. Solomon Adeyemi stopped walking. He was 3 feet from the podium at Gate B9, Hartsfield, Jackson, Atlanta International Airport on a Tuesday evening in December, when the holiday rush had transformed every terminal into its own particular theater of exhaustion and urgency. Outside, the floor-to-ceiling glass, the last pale light of the afternoon, was dissolving into cold dark, and the ground crew moved in orange vests between the belly of the aircraft and the luggage carts with the practiced efficiency of people who knew exactly how little time they had. Inside, the gate area hummed and pressed and shifted rolling suitcases, cutting paths through clusters of travelers, children draped over their parents' laps in various states of collapse, business people standing with their phones raised like small lanterns in the crowded dimness. Solomon had navigated all of it with the unhurried, deliberate calm of a man who had learned over the course of 46 years of being a tall black man, moving through spaces that were not always glad to receive him. That urgency in certain environments tended to invite a particular kind of attention he had no interest in receiving. He wore a charcoal blazer over a simple black turtleneck, dark slacks, no tie, no flash. His leather satchel was worn at the corners in the way that expensive things get worn when they are actually used rather than displayed. He moved like a man who knew where he was going, which he did, and who had every right to be where he was going, which he also did. The gate agent behind the podium had not looked at him when she spoke. She was looking at her monitor, one hand resting on the keyboard, a manicured nail tapping a slow, impatient rhythm against the edge of the desk. Her uniform was immaculate navy blue, pressed to a severity that suggested a relationship with the iron that went beyond professional obligation, and the gold wings pinned to her lapel caught the overhead light each time she shifted. Her hair was platinum blonde, pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to be doing structural work, and her face carried the particular set of features that comes from 17 years of deciding in the space of a glance who belongs and who needs to be redirected. Her name tag read, Diane. General boarding begins in 40 minutes. She continued still without looking up, gesturing vaguely toward the rows of seats behind Solomon with the back of her hand. You'll want to wait near the food court. There's a Subway and a Hudson News. Solomon stood very still for a moment. He had a boarding pass in the interior pocket of his blazer, a passport in the outer pocket, and a business-class ticket to Boston that he had purchased 6 weeks ago at full-fare seat 2A window suite because the lie-flat configuration was the only position that allowed his compressed lower back to approximate something like rest. He had been awake for 31 hours. He had performed 9 hours of open-chest surgery the previous evening on a 7-year-old girl with an aortic defect so rare his resident had needed to look it up. The girl was stable. Solomon was not particularly interested in standing near a subway for 40 minutes. He offered Diane a polite, measured smile, the same smile he used in pre-op consultations when he needed to project calm for a frightened family, and stepped forward. "I'm in priority boarding," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, low and unhurried, the voice of someone who had spent 2 decades giving instructions in operating rooms where panic was not an available option. Seat 2A. Diane's hand paused on the keyboard. She looked up. Her eyes traveled over him in the practiced, involuntary way that some people's eyes move when a calculation they have already completed is being confirmed rather than performed. The dark skin, the blazer, the worn satchel, the absence of an entourage or a companion or any of the visible markers she had learned without ever examining the learning to associate with the category of passenger who sat in seat 2A. The look lasted approximately 2 seconds. It was the most expensive 2 seconds of her career, though she did not know that yet. "Priority boarding is for first class and business select members," she said, her voice taking on a slightly elevated pitch of professional authority. "Do you have documentation of your status?" "I have my boarding pass," Solomon said, and began to reach for his jacket pocket. "System's running slow," Diane said, already turning back to her screen. "Why don't you step aside and I'll call you when I've had a chance to sort out the queue." There was no queue. The priority lane behind Solomon was entirely empty. The business class passengers were still in the lounge. Solomon looked at the empty lane. He looked at Diane. He took one step to his left, leaned against the glass wall, and waited with the controlled stillness of a man who had been in this exact position before, and who knew from experience the precise cost of reacting. Across the gate area, a young gate agent from the neighboring B7 boarding position, a woman named Keisha, 23, 6 weeks into the job, looked up from her terminal and watched the exchange. Then she looked toward the window near the far end of the gate where an older man in a faded maintenance jacket was standing with a cup of coffee watching the tarmac. And then she looked away very deliberately and went back to her screen. The hands were the first thing his residents noticed always. Dr. Solomon Adeyemi's hands were large and dark and perfectly still, even when the rest of him was in motion, and they had a quality that experienced surgical nurses described when asked as decided, not tense, not performing precision, but carrying it the way some people carry their posture without effort or advertisement. When those hands were in an operating theater, everything in the room organized itself around them without being asked. 32 hours before Gate B9, those hands were pressed flat against a scrubbed sink at Grady Memorial Hospital at 11 in the morning, and Solomon was staring at the middle distance above the faucet, the way surgeons do when a long case has just ended, and the body needs a moment to remember it is a body and not a machine. The surgery on Mariana Vega had begun at 2 in the morning and finished at 11:11. She was 7 years old and had been brought in by ambulance from a rural county 2 hours south of Atlanta, transferred 3 times in 48 hours, because the defect in her aorta was unusual enough that 2 other hospitals had stabilized her, and then called Grady. Solomon had been asleep 4 hours, which was more than he usually got on a call night when his phone lit up. He was in the OR within 90 minutes of the call. The defect was a variant he had seen twice before in his career, both times in adults, never in a child this small, and the repair required a period of circulatory arrest that his chief resident, Dr. Amara Osei, had spent most of the night trying not to visibly panic about. Solomon had talked her through it in the same way he talked through every difficult passage of a case, not with reassurance, which he considered clinically useless, but with information delivered in a low, steady stream that gave the mind something to hold on to while the hands did their work. Mariana Vega was in the pediatric ICU, now stable, her repaired aorta, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Her mother, a woman named Rosa, who had not slept in 3 days, had gripped Solomon's forearm in the family waiting room with both hands and said something in Spanish that he didn't entirely catch but understood completely. He changed out of his scrubs, answered 4 emails, and went to the pediatric ward before leaving the hospital. Not because it was expected of him, not because there was anything clinically useful he could do, but because Mariana had a stuffed rabbit named Dr. Carrot that she had brought from home in the ambulance, and that was currently sitting in the corner of her ICU bed with a small bandage wrapped around its ear, placed there by a night nurse who had a sense of humor, and Solomon wanted to tell her when she was awake enough to hear it that Dr. Carrot had done very good work and deserved a promotion. She was asleep. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then left. His colleague, Dr. Priya Nair, caught him at the elevator with the expression of someone who had been looking for him for 20 minutes for a reason that was going to require him to be somewhere he wasn't planning to be. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder, and had the specifically harried energy of a person managing 4 things simultaneously and not enjoying any of them. "You're going to Boston tonight," she said, handing him one of the cups. "You know that, right? Tonight, as in the flight, is at 8. "I'm aware," Solomon said. "Because I have your boarding pass right here," she said, producing it from the folder with the mild triumph of someone who had anticipated he might have forgotten. "Which you printed." On paper, in the year of our Lord. I don't trust things I can't hold, Solomon said. I know you don't, Priya said in the tone of someone who had heard this before and found it both endearing and exasperating in equal measure. The conference keynote is at 9 a.m. tomorrow. You're the first speaker. There will be 400 people in that room, and at least 2 of them will be actively looking for reasons to disagree with you, so I need you rested and not running on fumes and surgical adrenaline. The keynote was on institutional bias in healthcare resource allocation, specifically the ways in which the hidden assumptions embedded in hospital triage and insurance approval processes resulted in measurably different outcomes for patients of different races, not because of any individual bad actor, but because of the slow accumulated weight of decisions made by people who had never been asked to examine why they made them. Solomon had been working on the paper for 3 years. He had presented versions of it at 4 smaller conferences. This one was the largest platform he had been given, and he had no intention of softening it. I'll sleep on the plane, he said. You always say that, Priya said. This time I mean it, he said. I have a lie-flat seat. My back has been... Your back has been a situation since 2019, and you refuse to take more than 2 weeks off, which is a separate conversation. Priya said. Go, sleep. Don't miss the flight. He did not tell her that the conference topic, the ways institutions protect themselves by obscuring the mechanisms of their own bias, had been sitting with him differently lately, the way ideas sometimes shift from intellectual to personal when you have been living inside them long enough. He had been a black doctor in American hospitals for 20 years. He knew from the inside of that experience that the machinery of assumption did not stop at the hospital doors. He took the boarding pass from Priya. Paper printed slightly creased from the folder. He put it in his jacket pocket alongside his passport and walked out through the hospital's main entrance into the cold Atlanta afternoon, and for the first time in 32 hours, he breathed air that did not smell like antiseptic and recycled oxygen. And the sky above the parking structure was the specific pale gray of a December evening that is about to get darker, and somewhere above that gray there was a flight to Boston with his name on seat 2A. He did not know yet what was waiting for him at gate B9. Diane Caldwell arrived at work 90 minutes before her shift began every single day, and had done so for the better part of 17 years. And if you had asked her why, she would have told you it was professionalism, which was partially true and partially a story she had told herself so many times it had become indistinguishable from truth. The real reason was control. In the 90 minutes before the gate area filled with passengers and the boarding process began its particular chaos, Diane could arrange things exactly as she wanted them. The velvet rope dividers aligned at the precise angle that created a clear separation between priority and general boarding lanes. The podium surface cleared of the previous shift's debris. Coffee cups, forgotten lanyards, the crumpled boarding passes that less careful agents left behind, and her own workspace ordered in the specific way that allowed her to manage 5 things simultaneously without ever appearing to hurry. She moved through this ritual the way some people move through prayer, with the focused deliberateness of someone for whom the ritual itself is the point. She had been with Apex Airways for 17 years. She had started as a check-in agent, moved to gates within 2 years, and had been working the premium routes, the transatlantic flights, the business, heavy corridors, the flagship departures for the past 9 years. She had outlasted 4 station managers, survived 2 corporate mergers, and had watched the airline nearly collapse during a restructuring in 2018 with the equanimity of someone who understood instinctively that the people who ran the counters were more essential to the daily operation than the people who ran the company. She was not wrong about this exactly. She was wrong about almost everything else. The younger agents at B Concourse gave Diane a wide, respectful berth that was not entirely based on respect. It was based on the particular wisdom that comes from observing over time that some people have mastered the art of making complaints disappear. 2 agents had filed internal reports in the past 18 months. one about what they described as differential service treatment at Diane's gate, one about a specific incident involving a passenger removal that the filing agent believed was unjustified. Both reports had been closed by the station supervisor, Greg Fallow, with a notation that read, "Reviewed, no action required. Neither agent had tried again." Kevin Marsh, 26 years old and in his second year as a gate agent at the adjacent B7 position, had watched Diane for those 2 years, with the careful, methodical attention of someone who is building a case without being entirely sure what to do with it once it is built. He was quiet, observant, and possessed of a very good memory for the kinds of details that people in Diane's position relied on other people forgetting. He had not filed a complaint. He was still deciding whether the filing or the witnessing was the more useful role, and tonight was about to make that decision for him. Diane's system. She would not have called it a system. She would have called it reading the room or protecting the cabin or doing the job properly, operated on a set of assumptions so deeply embedded that they had long since passed below the level of conscious thought. Passengers in her categories arrived at the counter and received a response that was predetermined by their assignment to the category, and the categories were assigned in the first 2 seconds of visual contact, before a word was spoken, before a document was shown. The high-value category received warmth by name recognition when possible. Preemptive lounge passes the small upgrades within her discretion. These passengers tended to share certain visible characteristics. Age presentation, a particular kind of ease in premium spaces that reads as belonging, because it is the ease of someone who has always belonged there. The questionable category received friction procedural deniable, always framed in the language of security or protocol or system limitations. These passengers also tended to share characteristics, though Diane would not under any ordinary circumstances have been able to articulate what those characteristics were without the articulation revealing something she preferred not to examine. Sometime in the early afternoon before the international departures began, loading a young black man, college-aged alone, carrying a backpack and a bereavement fare ticket, had come to Diane's podium for an economy seat on a domestic flight. Diane had held him for 22 minutes, citing a name discrepancy that required supervisor verification. The supervisor never materialized. A white passenger in the general boarding queue who happened to have gone to college in the same city as the young man and struck up a 5-minute conversation with him while they waited, eventually turned to Diane and said, "I can vouch for him. We've been talking for several minutes. He seems perfectly fine," and Diane had processed the young man's boarding pass within 90 seconds of this statement. The young man's hands had been shaking when he handed over his boarding pass. He was flying to his grandfather's funeral. He did not file a complaint because the flight was about to leave, and he had learned from the experience of being the kind of person who gets held at counters that the time spent fighting is always time taken from somewhere else. Diane did not think about this interaction after it ended. She moved on to the next passenger with the smooth efficiency of someone for whom the interaction had been a routine exercise in protocol, and the day continued and the evening rush began to build. And at 6:43 p.m., she looked up from her monitor and saw a tall man in a charcoal blazer crossing the terminal toward her priority lane, and the calculation happened behind her eyes before she had formed a conscious thought, and she said, "Back of the line," before he had reached the counter, and she went back to her screen. This was the architecture of Diane, not monstrous, not cartoonish, but something perhaps more troubling than either. A person who had confused her prejudices with her professionalism for so long that she could no longer find the seam between them, and who had been protected year after year by a structure that had every incentive to look the other way. She did not see Walter Gaines until he was already standing at her counter. She should have looked harder at the man near the window. He had gotten the coffee from the kiosk near the B concourse entrance, the small one run by a man named Benny, who had been making terrible airport coffee for 11 years and was completely unapologetic about it. and he was standing at the window near gate B9 with the cup held in both hands, and his eyes on the tarmac below with the attentiveness of someone who is not watching casually, but seeing specifically, tracking the movement of the fuel truck, clocking the sequence in which the baggage handlers loaded the belly of the aircraft, noting the gap in the ground crew rotation near the forward cargo door that suggested someone was covering two positions instead of one. His name was Walter Gaines, though the faded green maintenance jacket he wore bore no name, and no airline insignia, only a small embroidered patch on the left sleeve that read ATL, Ground Operations, in letters worn soft by what appeared to be many washings. His cap was a standard Atlanta Braves ball cap, navy blue, pulled low enough that his face required a second look to read. His khakis were the kind that come from a department store and are worn without ceremony, and his canvas duffel looked like something that had been to many airports and remembered none of them fondly. He was 68 years old. His hair, where it showed beneath the cap's rim, was white and cropped close. His face was weathered in the way of someone who had spent decades outdoors and indoors in roughly equal measure, with the particular quality of lined skin that reads not as aged but as experienced. The difference being that age happens to you while experience is something you accumulate deliberately. His hands wrapped around the coffee cup were the hands of a man who had built things not metaphorically but literally, with tools and blueprints and the specific stubbornness of someone who refused to delegate the parts that mattered. He had flown commercially in the ordinary cabin under a name that appeared on no corporate manifests and drew no particular attention approximately 40 times in the past 4 years. He did not call these trips inspections because that word implied a formal process with a checklist and a report, and what Walter Gaines did on these trips was more fundamental than inspection. He came to watch. He came to see the airline that bore his name, that carried in its operational DNA the decisions he had made over 35 years of building it from a regional carrier with 4 planes and a borrowed hangar in Savannah to one of the 8 largest commercial airlines in the United States. He came to see it the way it actually was, not the way it was presented to him in quarterly reports and executive briefings, and the carefully curated excellence that tended to materialize around a chairman when the chairman was expected. He had seen extraordinary things on these trips, and he had seen terrible things, and he had made quiet changes afterward. A policy revision here, a staffing restructuring there, a phone call to a regional manager that the manager in question never fully understood the origin of, without ever revealing the source of his intelligence. He had not yet needed to be present at the moment of confrontation. Tonight was going to be different. He had noticed the interaction at gate B9 the moment it began, because he had positioned himself near the window specifically to be able to see the gate counter with an unobstructed line of sight, which was something he always did when he arrived at a gate early, which was something he always did. He watched Diane redirect Solomon without looking at his documents. He watched Solomon step to the left against the glass with that particular stillness that Walter recognized from long experience as the controlled response of someone who has decided that the cost of reacting outweighs the cost of waiting, and who is paying that cost with full awareness of what it is. Walter took a sip of the bad coffee and watched. He became aware at the periphery of his attention of a young woman from the neighboring gate who had clocked him and then very deliberately looked away, and this told him something useful about the state of awareness among the gate staff regarding his presence. Not everyone was unaware, but no one was going to say anything which was its own kind of information. He set the coffee cup on the windowsill and approached the regular counter, not the priority lane, the standard counter, and waited while Diane finished a transaction. When she turned to him, her expression was the specific kind of professionally managed impatience that people deploy when they have decided someone is going to be a problem before the problem has materialized. "I think there's a discrepancy with my seat assignment," Walter said. His voice was gravelly in the way of someone who had smoked cigars in their 40s and quit in their 50s and still carried the echo of it in their vocal cords. Shows me bumped to standby, but I've got a confirmed booking. Diane looked at his boarding pass, looked at him, and delivered the non-revenue passenger speech. Standby travelers employee rates. 0, priority, fully booked flight. Take a seat and wait with the crisp efficiency of someone who had given it hundreds of times and found the repetition satisfying rather than tedious. Walter noted mildly that the load screen he could see from where he was standing showed the flight at 83% capacity with open seats in business. Diane's expression shifted to the specific temperature of someone who does not enjoy being contradicted by people she has already categorized. She told him with a smile that carried no warmth at all that he was welcome to wait near the food court, and that she would call him if anything opened up, and that standby passengers who created difficulties at the gate were routinely removed from the list entirely, so he should think carefully about how he wanted to proceed. Walter looked at her for a moment with the calm, measured regard of someone taking a very careful inventory. "All right," he said. He picked up his duffel and walked back toward the window. Near the adjacent gate, Keisha, the young agent who had looked at Walter and then very deliberately looked elsewhere, typed something into her terminal with slightly more force than the task required and pressed her lips together and said nothing. Kevin at gate B7 watched Walter settle back at the window and then looked at Diane and then looked at his own terminal screen and went very still in the way people go still when they realize something that has been building for a long time is about to arrive. 12 minutes passed. 12 minutes during which Diane processed 2 other passengers through the priority lane, both white, both male, both greeted by name. One given a lounge pass upgrade with a warmth that was almost theatrical in its contrast to the temperature she had applied to the 6-foot black doctor currently standing against the glass wall to her left, and during which Solomon Adeyemi stood completely still and watched the ground crew finish loading the belly of the aircraft and thought about Mariana Vega's aorta and tried not to think about the fact that every minute standing here was a minute closer to missing a flight he could not afford to miss. He approached the counter again. He placed his boarding pass and his passport on the surface simultaneously side by side, with the deliberate calm of someone performing a gesture they have performed before in similar circumstances. And no must be made without aggression, without impatience, without any physical expression that can be reinterpreted as threatening by a person who is looking for a reason to reinterpret things. "I'd like to get this sorted out," he said. "I'm in seat 2A, business first cabin. I booked this ticket 6 weeks ago." Diane looked at the documents. The way someone looks at something they have already decided is problematic with the slightly narrowed attention of pre-made conclusion rather than open reading. She did not pick them up. Instead, she began typing with performative urgency, frowning at her monitor as though decoding something complex in the system that required her full concentration. "There's a notation on this reservation," she said without looking up. "What kind of notation?" Solomon asked. "A security flag," Diane said. "It's been tagged for additional verification. I can't override it at the gate level." "I checked in online 2 hours ago," Solomon said. "I received a confirmation. My seat was assigned and confirmed at that time." "Online check-in doesn't clear all flags," Diane said. "What specifically is flagged?" Solomon asked. A pause, the length of which was itself informative. "I can't disclose the details of a security notation to the passenger it concerns," she said. "That's protocol." Solomon looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is holding a very large amount of something very heavy and has decided for reasons entirely his own to keep holding it rather than put it down. "Would you like to see the credit card I used to purchase the ticket?" he asked. "I have it with me." "That's not the verification process for a flagged reservation," Diane said. "You'd need to present at the security office in the main terminal. Boarding begins in 8 minutes, Solomon said. "I'm aware," Diane said with the particular brightness of someone who is aware and is not troubled by the information. "Is there a supervisor I can speak with?" Solomon asked. "I'll reach out when I have a moment," Diane said, and turned back to her screen with the definitive energy of someone who has closed a door. Solomon stepped to the side of the counter. He did not lean against the wall. This time he stood straight-backed, hands loose at his sides, and looked at Diane with the calm, unblinking regard of someone deciding how much patience they have left, and finding the answer complicated. At the Gate B7 podium, Kevin had stopped pretending to work. He had opened the flight manifest on his own terminal. Not his flight, not his responsibility, not within his official purview, and was reading Solomon's reservation record with the focused attention of someone who already suspected what they were going to find and needed to see it confirmed anyway. What the screen showed him was booking confirmed 41 days prior, full business class fare seat 2, A status cleared 0, flags 0 alerts, 0 notations of any kind. The reservation was as clean as a reservation gets. Kevin looked at Diane. He looked at Solomon. He looked at his own hands on the keyboard for a moment with the expression of someone standing at a door they have been standing at for 14 months trying to decide whether to open it. He did not open it yet. Near the window, Walter Gaines had set his coffee cup down. He was not watching the tarmac anymore. Lawrence Draper arrived at the priority lane at 6:59 with the ease of a man who had made this particular journey so many times that the airport had become a kind of second living room. He knew the code for the lounge, knew the name of the gate agent he preferred, and moved through the boarding process with the relaxed fluency of someone who has never in his adult life been asked to wait. Diane saw him coming from 6 feet away and her face changed. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was the small, immediate softening that happens when a person encounters something that feels like relief, and the relief in this case was the arrival of someone who fit without complication or friction, the mental model Diane had built of what a passenger in seat 1A was supposed to look like. She greeted him by name before he reached the podium. She asked about the golf tournament in Scottsdale. She processed his documents in under 80 seconds. Handed him a lounge pass with both hands, and a smile that reached all the way to her eyes and sent him toward the jet bridge with the warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed her work. The contrast was not subtle. It was witnessed by a woman named Marisol Cruz, who was sitting in the 3rd row of the gate area, seating with a carry-on between her feet and a digital recorder running inside her jacket pocket. Not for any deceptive purpose, but because Marisol Cruz was a journalist who had been covering a feature on unreported discrimination in commercial air travel for 6 months, and had learned at airport number 4 of 6 that the most important moments tended to happen when she was not visibly ready for them, so she had simply made herself permanently ready. She had watched Solomon be redirected without his documents being checked. She had watched the 12-minute wait. She had watched 2 other passengers processed with 0 friction, and now she was watching Diane hand Lawrence Draper a lounge pass with the tenderness of someone doing something they loved. And Solomon Adeyemi was still standing 2 feet from the counter against the wall, and the geometry of what was happening in this gate area was so clear and so undeniable that Marisol's hand found the recorder through the fabric of her pocket, and she pressed the button that increased the sensitivity of the microphone without quite deciding to do so. It was the gesture of someone whose instincts had made a decision before their conscious mind had caught up. The 2 college students in the row behind Marisol had noticed too. They were both on their phones, already not filming yet, but with the phones raised and held in that particular half-ready position that precedes filming the position of someone who is watching a situation escalate and is deciding whether this is the moment. An older black woman named Vivian, who was traveling alone to visit her daughter in Boston and had been waiting at gate B9 since 6:15, had moved to the edge of her seat. She was not a confrontational person by nature. She was a retired school teacher from Decatur, who had spent 30 years choosing her battles with the precision of someone who understood that not all battles were winnable and that winning the wrong ones at the wrong time had its own cost. But she had been watching Solomon for 20 minutes, and the thing about watching a person be systematically diminished in a public space is that at a certain point, the watching itself becomes a form of complicity that she was no longer willing to perform. Solomon stepped to the counter for the second time. He stated clearly and without heat that it had been 12 minutes, that boarding was in 6 minutes, that he had a valid ticket, and that he would like the issue resolved before the flight was called. Diane's response, delivered at a volume that was calibrated just above the ambient noise of the gate area, which meant it was audible to approximately 20 people, was that his reservation was still under security review. That hovering at the counter constituted a disruption of gate operations, and that if he continued to pressure gate staff, she would be required to note it in his passenger file as an incident. He had not raised his voice. He had not touched anyone or anything. He had placed documents on a counter and asked questions. "He's just standing there," Vivian said from her seat. She did not shout it. She said it at a conversational volume to no one in particular, the way a person articulates something that seems too obvious to be a statement but needs to be said anyway. Diane turned to look at her. "Ma'am," she said with a brightness that was its own form of warning, "this is a private transaction between gate staff and a passenger." "I'd ask you not to involve yourself." The dismissal of a witness spoken aloud in public to a woman who had done nothing but describe what she saw did something to the atmosphere of Gate B9 that no individual act of Diane's had quite managed to do. It made the situation collective. It told everyone watching that the behavior at the counter was not going to be moderated by the presence of an audience, and the audience, understanding this, began to make its own decisions. 4 phones appeared in the gate area, raised and filming not all at once, but in a staggered sequence that had the effect of a tide coming in. Kevin at the adjacent podium had his hands flat on the keyboard and his eyes fixed on the middle distance with the expression of a man who is rehearsing something he is about to do and is making sure before he does it that he can live with the consequences. Walter Gaines had moved from the window. He was walking toward the counter now, not quickly, not urgently, but with the directional certainty of a man who has waited long enough. The moment Diane decided to call security was visible in her body before it was visible in her actions, a straightening of the spine, a settling of the jaw, the particular micro-expression of someone who has made a choice and is now committed to seeing it through, regardless of what the evidence around them suggests. She reached for the phone on the podium. Solomon watched her hand move toward it and said calmly in a voice pitched low enough that it required the people nearest to lean slightly forward to hear. "Before you make that call, I'd like to say for the record, and for the people recording this, my name is Dr. Solomon Adeyemi. I am the Chief of Pediatric Cardiac Surgery at Grady Memorial Hospital. I am holding a valid business class ticket to Boston Seat 2A, purchased 6 weeks ago at full fare, and I have not at any point in the last 20 minutes raised my voice, touched anyone, or behaved in any manner that could be reasonably described as aggressive or disruptive." He paused and then added in exactly the same tone, "I just want to get to Boston." Diane picked up the phone anyway. There was a particular kind of courage required to watch that happen and do nothing, and most of the people in the gate area were discovering in real time the precise boundary of their own. Some crossed it and some didn't, and the ones who crossed it would remember this night differently than the ones who didn't, and both groups would remember it for a long time. "This is Gate B9, Diane said into the phone. "I have a passenger situation at the podium. I need security support, possible code 4. She listened for a moment. "That's correct. Non-compliant passenger refusing to clear the boarding lane." She set the phone down and looked at Solomon with an expression that said she had just done something decisive and professional and was prepared to stand behind it entirely. Solomon looked at her. He did not say anything. The silence was not empty. It was dense with everything that was not being said, and the weight of it pressed outward into the gate area, and the people sitting in it felt it like a change in air pressure. Walter had reached the counter. He set his canvas duffel on the floor beside the podium with a deliberate thud that punctuated the silence in a way that made several people look over. He looked at Diane with an expression that had finished with amusement some time ago and had arrived somewhere considerably more resolute. "I think Walter said in his gravelly, unhurried voice that you might want to reconsider the last few minutes." Diane turned to him with the specifically brittle authority of someone whose sense of control is beginning to develop. Hairline fractures they cannot yet see but can feel. "Sir," she said, "standby passengers are not part of this interaction. I need you to step back and wait until I call." "I've been waiting," Walter said. "You'll continue waiting," Diane said, "or I will remove you from the standby list entirely. The choice is yours." She turned back toward the podium phone where 2 TSA officers were already visible at the far end of the concourse, moving toward B9 at a brisk walk, responding to her code. 4 call hands near their belts, faces wearing the professional blankness of people approaching an unknown situation. Walter watched them come. Then he reached into the interior of his maintenance jacket, not into the duffel, not dramatically but slowly, and with full visibility in the clear overhead light of the gate area, and removed a slim black credentials wallet. Diane saw the movement. The particular alarm of someone who has been performing authority, without fully thinking through the consequences of what that performance might set in motion, flooded her face. She took a half step back from the podium. Her voice came out higher than she intended. "He's reaching into his jacket," she said loudly toward the approaching officers. "He's reaching." The gate area contracted. A woman near the boarding door grabbed her child's arm. One of the filming college students said, "Oh my God," at a volume that was captured clearly on at least 3 recordings. The TSA officers broke into a jog. Walter placed the credentials wallet on the counter, opened it, and turned it to face Diane. He did not say anything. He simply waited for her to read it. The gate area at B9 had become something different in the 30 minutes since Solomon Adeyemi first placed his boarding pass on the counter, and the transformation was the kind that happens not through any single dramatic event, but through the slow, steady accumulation of smaller ones. Each individual moment small enough to dismiss in isolation, but stacked together into something that altered the atmosphere of the space. The way weather changes before a storm, perceptibly, undeniably, and in ways that everyone present registered on the level of the body before the mind had caught up. Vivian, the retired school teacher from Decatur, had moved from her seat to standing. She stood near the end of the gate area, seating arms folded, not blocking anything, not advancing toward the counter but present in the upright, deliberate way of someone who has decided that sitting is no longer an option they are willing to accept. Her carry-on was at her feet. Her boarding pass was in her hand. She was not going anywhere until this was resolved. Marisol Cruz had her notepad open on her knee, now recorder running openly. She had stopped trying to be inconspicuous approximately 15 minutes ago when she realized that the situation at Gate B9 was not going to resolve quietly, and that her professional obligation had shifted from passive documentation to active witnessing. She had already identified 4 separate people around her who were filming on their phones. One of them, a college student named Brandon, 20 years old with 47,000 social media followers, had been live streaming for 11 minutes, and the concurrent viewer count was climbing past 8,000 and still rising. The white couple who had been sitting near the window, mid-40s, the man in a fleece, and the woman in a down coat, the particular demographic of people who travel for Thanksgiving in business class and generally prefer not to be drawn into confrontation, had without discussion between them, both stood up. The man had taken a step forward in the way that men sometimes do when they have decided to stop being bystanders and are still figuring out what being something else looks like. Neither of them had spoken yet. But they were standing. Captain David Okafor had come through the jet bridge door at 6:53 to check on the boarding delay. The aircraft was ready, the crew was ready, and the gate was not moving, and in 30 years of flying delays at the gate before a single ticket was scanned, were the category of problem most likely to cascade into something genuinely disruptive. He was Nigerian-American, 54 years old, with the military bearing of someone who had flown C-17 before commercial aviation, and still stood as though he was about to receive an inspection. He took in the scene at the podium. Solomon against the wall. Diane on the phone. The cameras, the watching crowd. The older woman standing with her arms folded in approximately 4 seconds with the focused assessment of someone trained to read a situation quickly and correctly, and he went completely still in the doorway. He did not speak, but he did not go back through the jet bridge door. Solomon, standing in his 2-foot exile beside the counter, was aware of all of it. The cameras, the standing woman, the captain in the doorway, the growing density of attention pressing in from all sides, and he was aware of it. The way a surgeon is aware of everyone in the operating room without making direct eye contact with any of them peripherally and comprehensively. He was not performing patience. He was not performing dignity. He was simply being still in the way that costs something real, the way stillness always costs something. When the alternative is a response that would be completely justified and completely ruinous, and paying that cost with the full and clear-eyed understanding that the people who demanded it of him had never been asked to pay it themselves, and never would be. This was the thing about 30 minutes at Gate B9 that Marisol Cruz would write about later in the piece, that ran in 5 countries and was read by 11 million people, and was the account that a congressional subcommittee entered into the formal record. It was not the loudness of what happened, she wrote, but the silence of the man at the center of it. Dr. Adeyemi did not perform his own innocence. He simply was innocent, and he stood there being it, and the contrast between his stillness and the noise around him was the most devastating thing in the room. She would write it later. Right now, she was watching Walter Gaines place a credentials wallet on the counter, open it, and wait. Diane read the name on the card the way people read things they cannot process immediately, 3 times each reading slightly slower than the last, as though the problem were one of comprehension rather than belief. But she had understood it on the first reading. The difficulty was not understanding. The difficulty was that understanding what the card said required her to simultaneously understand everything that came with it. And that understanding was arriving all at once from all directions, and her mind was doing the specific thing that minds do when faced with an irreversible error of catastrophic magnitude. It was trying desperately and futilely to find a version of the last 30 minutes in which things had gone differently. There was no such version. She had not yet spoken when she made the decision. The worst decision in a sequence of increasingly bad decisions to act before the TSA officers arrived and took the situation out of her hands entirely. She stepped back to her terminal. She looked at Solomon's reservation on the screen. She did not look at Solomon. She typed 4 keystrokes, the override sequence she had used conservatively 300 times in the past 4 years, and entered the reason code other/undisclosed. She hit enter. The confirmation appeared on screen. Reservation canceled. Refund processing. 7 to 10 business days. She said without looking up from the screen, "Your ticket has been canceled and a refund has been issued. You're free to rebook through the app or at the main ticketing desk in Terminal A." The gate area went so quiet that the ambient noise of the terminal, the announcements, the rolling suitcases, the distant crying of a child rushed in to fill the space like water filling a container. Solomon looked at the screen. He looked at Diane. He was very still for a moment in the specific way of someone who has just had something taken from them that cannot be simply retrieved. Not just the ticket, not just the seat, but the plans built around both of them. The keynote he had prepared for 3 years. The medical consultation he had scheduled from Boston for a patient he had called earlier that day to confirm the lie-flat seat and the sleep his compressed disc needed. Badly enough that he had booked the flight 3 weeks earlier than he otherwise would have. "Restore the ticket," he said. "I can't reverse a security cancellation," Diane said. "Then I need your supervisor," Solomon said. "Right now." "I'll put in a request," Diane said. "I need your name and employee ID for a formal complaint," Solomon said. Diane slid a generic customer service card across the counter without speaking. Walter Gaines had been watching this with the compressed focus of a man who has been patient for a long time and has now reached the precise end of patience. He stepped forward to the counter, directly to the counter, not to the side, and placed his duffel bag on the floor with a sound that cut through the quiet like a period at the end of a sentence. He looked at Diane, and his voice when he spoke was not raised. It was, if anything, quieter than it had been, which somehow made it carry further. "I'm going to ask you to stop what you're doing," he said. The TSA officers had arrived at the podium. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man named Sergeant Bricker, whose expression suggested he had been dispatched to manage a genuine emergency and was rapidly recalibrating, looked between Diane and the two men at the counter and the 80 people filming in the gate area, and settled on the posture of someone who needs more information before doing anything. "We got a call about a weapon," Sergeant Bricker said. "I called it in," Diane said immediately. He was reaching into his bag in a threatening manner. She indicated Walter. Sergeant Bricker looked at Walter. Walter's hands were visible, both of them resting on the counter on either side of the credentials wallet. The wallet was open. The sergeant looked down at it. He read the name. His expression did not change dramatically, but something shifted in the economy of it. A very slight adjustment around the eyes, a fractional stiffening of posture, the specific recalibration of a professional who has just realized the geometry of a situation is completely different from what he was told when he was sent. Walter turned the wallet so it was fully visible to the cameras and to the crowd, and to Diane and to the sergeant, and to Captain Okafor in the jet bridge doorway who had taken 2 steps forward, and whose face had the expression of a man watching something he had suspected was possible, but had never quite imagined he would see. "My name is Walter James Gaines," Walter said in his quiet, gravelly, entirely certain voice. "I am the founder and chairman of the board of Apex Airways," he let it settle. "This is my airline," he said. "That is my plane. And this man," he turned slightly toward Solomon, not pointing, just orienting, "has a valid paid confirmed ticket that you just canceled. I watched you do it." Diane opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "I also watched Walter continued at the same measured pace every other thing you did at this counter tonight." The recording on Brandon's phone, which had been live streaming for 18 minutes, to a viewership that had just passed 16,000 people and was doubling every 4 minutes, captured what happened to Diane's face in the next 3 seconds with a clarity that no description could entirely replicate. But the most accurate way to say it is this: something that had been holding for 17 years. Let go. Before you continue watching, if you believe no one should be humiliated simply for showing up, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel. It keeps stories like this one alive. Now let's continue. Walter removed his Braves cap. Beneath it, white hair cropped close against his scalp, and a face that appeared on the cover of Apex Airways' annual shareholder report every year, a face that was also on the framed portrait in the executive lounge at this very airport, and on the brass plaque outside the Walter J. Gaines Pediatric Air Transport Fund building at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and in the photograph on the wall of every Apex Airways break room in 37 cities, the one captioned, "Our founder in the navy and gold of the airline's brand colors." Sergeant Bricker, who had been in law enforcement long enough to know the particular feeling of a situation that has just become significantly larger and more consequential than the one he was dispatched to handle, lowered his hand from his belt entirely and took a small, careful step backward from the center of the scene. The instinctive repositioning of a professional who understands that his role has just shifted from respondent to witness. The second TSA officer had stopped writing in his notebook. Captain Okafor walked fully out of the jet bridge doorway and into the gate area, removing his hat. As he did so, not a dramatic gesture but an instinctive one, The kind of physical acknowledgement that the body makes before the mind has fully articulated why. "Mr. Gaines," Captain Okafor said, and the two words carried everything that needed to be in them. Walter gave him a brief nod. Diane had not moved. She was standing behind the podium with her hands at her sides, and the specific frozen quality of a person whose internal processing has overwhelmed their capacity for external action, and she was staring at the credentials wallet on the counter with the expression of someone hoping that if they look at it long enough it will resolve into something other than what it is. Walter leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the high counter, and looked at Diane with an expression that was not angry. Anger would have been easier to manage, but was instead something more methodical, the expression of a man who has already decided what happens next and is taking the time for a final clear accounting before he closes the door. "I'm going to tell you what I watched tonight," Walter said. "Not what I was told, not what was reported to me. What I personally observed standing at that window for the past 30 minutes. He began. He told her one item at a time in the plain and specific language of someone who has spent a lifetime building systems and understands exactly how each failure in a system is connected to the next. He had watched her redirect a paying passenger from the priority lane before looking at his documents. He had watched her fabricate a security flag for a reservation that carried no flags whatsoever. He had watched her process other passengers through the same lane with zero friction and visible warmth. He had watched her publicly announce that a composed stationary man was aggressive and disrupting gate operations. He had watched her cancel a validly purchased ticket using a manual override. And he had watched her call law enforcement and tell them a senior citizen reaching into his own jacket was reaching for a weapon. Each item landed in the silence of the gate area, the way stones land in still water, not with the explosive impact of something thrown hard, but with the heavier, truer sound of something that simply has weight and has been dropped. Diane's mouth opened when he reached the fourth item. Walter looked at her without breaking his account, and she closed it. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said in the same measured voice, "Do you have anything to say?" What came out of Diane was not a defense exactly, but the residue of one. The language of 17 years of institutional protection. The words that had always worked before, the phrases that station supervisors had always been willing to hear and file away and close without action. The security protocols, the training materials, the mandate to protect the cabin, the impossibility of knowing every passenger's background, the pressure of doing a difficult job without adequate support. It was a genuinely human sound, not malicious in its delivery, but hollow in the way that explanations become hollow when the thing they are explaining cannot actually be explained away, only described. The explanation collapsed somewhere in its third sentence. Diane heard it collapse. The people around her heard it too. "Step away from the podium," Walter said. Walter moved around the counter. "You can't come back here," Diane said. It came out reflexively, habit pulling words through a channel that had been running for 17 years, even though the authority behind the words was gone. "This is a secured operations area. Only credentialed I know what it is." Walter said, "I built the security specification for it in 2004. He stood at Diane's terminal and looked at the screen with the specific familiarity of someone returning to an interface they designed, rather than learned the intuitive ease of authorship, not training. His fingers moved across the keyboard with quiet efficiency, pulling up the gate management system's administrative view, a layer of the software that required chairman-level credentials to access, and that most of the people who used this system every day did not know existed. He began to narrate. Not for the court of public opinion, though. 80 people with camera phones were listening and roughly 30,000 on the live stream, but with the specific factual clarity of someone who believes that the truth laid plainly in front of people does its own work without assistance. Solomon Adeyemi, Seat 2. A Walter said, pulling up the reservation. Booked 41 days ago. Full business class fare. Confirmation issued. Status cleared. Flags none. Alerts none. Notations none. He turned the screen slightly so it was visible to the nearest cameras. This reservation was clean when he booked it, clean when he checked in online 2 hours ago, and clean right now. There was no flag. There was never a flag. He navigated to the override log. The timestamp showed Diane's ID, the time of the override 18 minutes into Solomon's wait, and the reason code, other/undisclosed. No specific reason given. Walter said, because there was no specific reason. The reason was what she saw when she looked at him, which is not a reason that exists anywhere in our operating manual. He pulled up the load manifest. Flight at 83% capacity. 5 open seats in the business first cabin. 2 in the premium forward section. He looked at Diane. You told me the flight was oversold when I asked about the standby discrepancy. You told me there was no room. The system says there are 7 empty seats. He navigated to the standby list. At the top, flagged with a yellow priority notation and a code that linked to a separate file the name Garrett Osley. Walter looked at the notation. He looked at Kevin, who had moved from the adjacent podium to the edge of the gate area, and was standing very still with the expression of someone who has been waiting for this moment, and is now confronted with its actual arrival, trying to determine whether they are relieved or terrified, or both. Kevin, Walter said. His voice carried the way quiet voices carry when there is no other sound in the room. Come here. Kevin walked to the counter with the specific deliberateness of someone who has already made a decision and is now honoring it. He stood next to Walter and looked at the screen and looked at the Garrett Osley notation, and something in his posture shifted the compressed tension of a person who has been holding something for a long time and is now finally being asked to put it down. Tell me what that notation means, Walter said. Kevin's pause lasted 4 seconds. It was long enough for anyone watching to understand that what came next was not a simple answer. It means Kevin said that Garrett Osley has a priority placement arrangement. He flies Atlanta to Boston 14 times a year, always in business first. He has a guaranteed seat regardless of his actual booking status because someone at this gate makes sure he has one. How? Walter asked. Kevin looked at the screen, not at Diane. The same way you just saw. A legitimate ticket gets flagged. No real flag. Just the override. The seat opens up and Osley gets placed in it as a complimentary upgrade coded as a customer service accommodation. It looks like a goodwill gesture in the records. It isn't. Who authorizes it? Walter asked. It doesn't require authorization, Kevin said. That's the problem. A senior gate agent can execute the override without supervisor sign-off. The complaint pathway requires the complaint to go through the station's supervisor before it reaches anyone above that level. And the complaints that have come through about this gate, Walter asked, were closed by the station supervisor, Kevin said. I filed 2 of them. The gate area was silent enough that the sound of Marisol Cruz's pen moving across her notepad was audible in the nearest rows. Walter straightened up from the terminal. He looked at the screen for a moment longer with the expression of a man who has built something over 35 years and is confronting in specific and quantifiable detail the gap between what he built and what it became. Then he looked at Solomon, who had been standing to the side throughout all of this with the still watchful composure of someone receiving information they had suspected but needed confirmed. How many passengers, Solomon asked. Kevin's answer was quiet and conservative and landed like a fist in the quiet room. 14 months of documented override activity, averaging multiple incidents per week across a network of arrangements that Kevin had been piecing together since his first complaint was closed without explanation. The number was in the hundreds. What Kevin explained standing at the counter of Gate B9 with the overhead lights of the terminal pressing down and 80 recording phones capturing every word was not a story of one person's corruption, but of a small, carefully maintained ecosystem of it, the specific kind that grows in institutional spaces, where the complaint mechanism and the corrupting force share a supervisor. Garrett Osley was not a criminal in the way that the word implies calculation and concealment and the cold mechanics of organized crime. He was something more banal and perhaps more troubling. A frequent traveler who had discovered through a series of small tests over several years that a certain gate agent at a certain airport was willing for a reliable fee to ensure that the experience of air travel was entirely frictionless for him, regardless of what his ticket actually entitled him to. He paid in cash in irregular amounts through a method that Kevin described as the envelope in the parking garage, a phrase that sounded in the flat fluorescent light of the gate area almost satirically cinematic, except that Kevin's face when he said it made clear that he was not being satirical at all. The arrangement had begun small, an upgrade here, a boarding priority there, and had grown over 4 years into something considerably more structured. A guaranteed first-class placement on every Atlanta-Boston flight Osley took. Funded by the cancellation of legitimate tickets belonging to passengers Diane had assessed as unlikely to fight back effectively. The assessment criteria, Kevin explained, were not written down anywhere because they did not need to be. They were the same criteria. Diane applied to everything, a rapid visual categorization, a gut determination of who had recourse and who didn't, and the particular confidence of someone who had been making these decisions for years without meaningful consequences. The routing of complaints through Greg Fallow, the station supervisor, a man Kevin described with the careful restraint of someone who has a great deal more to say and is choosing the minimal version, had provided the structural protection the arrangement needed to survive. Fallow's closed without action notations on Kevin's 2 complaints, and on at least 3 others Kevin was aware of, filed by other agents, had created the conditions in which Diane could operate with the confidence of impunity, which is the most dangerous kind of confidence because it is for a long time entirely justified. Walter listened to all of this without interruption, standing at Diane's terminal with his hands flat on the counter and his eyes on Kevin's face, and the expression he wore was not surprise. He had spent 35 years in an industry and understood in the way that people who build things understand that the structures that enable corruption are rarely dramatic or exotic. They are almost always the ordinary machinery of accountability, slightly misaligned over a long enough period of time. When Kevin finished, Walter looked at Solomon. "How many people in your estimation were bumped the way you were nearly bumped tonight?" Walter asked. Solomon, who had been doing the arithmetic quietly in his mind as Kevin spoke, said, "If the frequency Kevin is describing is accurate, and if the arrangement has been running for the duration he's indicating, then you're looking at somewhere between 300 and 400 passengers whose travel plans were disrupted without cause, without explanation, and without any functional recourse. 300 people who had stood at a counter, been told their ticket had a problem been made to feel like the problem, and had either missed their flights or rebooked or simply absorbed the disruption into the ordinary texture of being the kind of person things like this happened to, and said nothing, because saying something had never seemed worth what it cost." Walter was quiet for a long moment. Diane had not spoken since her explanation had collapsed. She was standing to the side of the podium now, and the specificity of what was being described, the mechanism, the timeline, the numbers, was doing something to her face that was different from the fear and the shock that had preceded it. Something more interior. The particular look of a person hearing their own actions described accurately and in detail for the first time, without the protective filter of their own narration. Sergeant Bricker, who had been standing at the edge of the gate area in the posture of a man who came to handle a code 4 and has found himself in a congressional hearing, cleared his throat and said quietly, "Mr. Gaines, I think we're going to need to make some calls." "We already are," Walter said. He pulled out his phone. He dialed his head of corporate security, a woman named Vera Okonkwo, who answered on the second ring at any hour, and who had been in airline security for 20 years, and who, When Walter finished a 2-minute summary of what he had witnessed and what Kevin had described, said in a voice of complete professional calm, "I'll have a team at the station manager's office within the hour." Walter hung up. He looked at the gate area, the cameras, the standing witnesses, Vivian, with her arms still folded, Marisol Cruz, still writing, Captain Okafor, still present the flight, still waiting at the end of the jet bridge, and he did the thing that leadership in its truest form requires. He turned to face it. Walter looked at Solomon and said, "I owe you an apology. Not the corporate kind, not the liability-conscious PR-vetted, carefully hedged language of institutional accountability that begins with 'we regret' and ends with a voucher code. He said it the way a person says it when they mean it specifically, when they understand precisely what they are apologizing for and to whom and why the apology matters more than any remedy that could accompany it. He named the specific harms one by one in the same plain accounting he had used at the terminal a few minutes before Solomon's ticket canceled without cause. His travel plans disrupted 12 minutes spent standing against a glass wall being treated as a suspect in his own itinerary. A security flag fabricated and applied to his name in an airline's official records. A flag that had Walter not been present, and had the situation been allowed to run its ordinary course, might have followed Solomon through future bookings and generated future friction that he would have had no mechanism to challenge because he would never have known it existed. Solomon listened to the apology with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that mattered, which was the same quality of attention he gave to everything complete still, without the restless need to respond before the other person was finished. When Walter was done, Solomon said, "Thank you. I mean that." He paused for a moment, looking at the empty podium where Diane's uniform had stood for 17 years, and then he said something that Walter had not expected, something that stopped the chairman mid-breath and held him there. "I don't want only her punished," Solomon said. Walter waited. "She's the visible part," Solomon said, "and what she did was wrong and I want it addressed fully. But the reason she was able to do it for years to hundreds of people without meaningful consequence, that's not her. That's something in the structure of this place that created the conditions for her that told her every time a complaint was closed and nothing changed that she was operating within acceptable limits." He looked at Walter directly. "In medicine, we call that an enabling environment. You don't fix it by removing the symptom. You fix it by addressing what produced the symptom." Walter was quiet. "I know that's a larger thing to ask," Solomon said. "I know it's harder and more expensive and takes longer. But I'm a doctor. I've watched what happens when you treat only what you can see." Walter held that for a moment in the way that people hold things that are true and inconvenient and necessary. Then he said, "You're right, and I know you're right." He turned to the terminal. He pulled up Solomon's booking record, restored the reservation, and then navigated to a section of the system that required a different set of credentials, a level of access that appeared on no standard training menu, and generated a small, discrete chime when the credentials were entered, the sound of a door that is rarely opened. He made 4 keystrokes. The printer at the edge of the podium produced a boarding pass. Walter picked it up and held it out to Solomon. "This is the chairman's suite," he said. "Forward of the business first cabin, private door full flat bed shower." He said it without ceremony. "It's not an upgrade. It's a restoration of what you should have had from the beginning, and then some, because what you experienced here tonight deserved more than equivalence." Solomon looked at the boarding pass. He tried briefly to decline. He said that 2A was fine, that he didn't need, and Walter said firmly and without irritation, "I know you don't need it. I'm asking you to accept it anyway because there is a difference between charity and restitution, and this is the second kind." Solomon took the boarding pass. Captain Okafor stepped forward from where he had been standing and said, "Doctor, if you'll follow me," and the gesture, the captain personally escorting a passenger down the jet bridge, it carried a particular weight that every person in the gate area understood without it needing to be explained. Solomon picked up his leather satchel and moved toward the jet bridge door and the gate area, which had been holding its breath for the better part of an hour. Released something that was not quite applause and not quite silence, but something in between. A collective exhale, the sound of people who have watched something go wrong and then improbably begin to go right. At the jet bridge door, Solomon stopped. He turned back to Walter, who was standing at the podium making a phone call, and waited until Walter lowered the phone. "One more thing," Solomon said. Walter looked at him. "When you do the investigation, and I know you're going to do it thoroughly because I can tell that about you don't design whatever comes next around preventing another Diane." He said her name without venom, just precision. Design it around making sure the next Diane can't survive. There's a difference. One is reactive, the other changes the architecture. Walter looked at him for a long moment. "How many years have you been a surgeon?" Walter asked. 22, Solomon said. "It shows," Walter said. Solomon nodded once and followed Captain Okafor down the jet bridge. Walter stood at the empty podium for a moment, looking at the space where Diane's uniform had been for 17 years. Then he turned to face the gate area, the cameras still rolling, the passengers still watching Marisol cruise with her pen poised, Vivian finally sitting back down, Brandon still live streaming to a viewership that had just crossed 40,000, and he addressed them directly without preamble or corporate language, in the plain voice of a man who had built something and was now accountable for all of it, the good and the failure both. He acknowledged what they had witnessed. He confirmed that an investigation would begin tonight. He told them that the flight would board immediately, and that every economy passenger who had been present for the events at Gate B9 that evening would receive a complimentary upgrade to the available business class seats. Not as a bribe, he said, not as a silencing, but because they had had to stand in the middle of a failure that should never have happened, and the least the airline could do was make sure they arrived in Boston with more comfort than they had been promised. Then he told Diane, who had been standing to the side of the podium in the specific diminished posture of someone whose armor has been completely removed, that she needed to surrender her badge. She did not argue the way she had feared she might. She unclipped it from her lapel with hands that were not steady, and the small click of the badge coming free of the fabric was the quietest sound that had happened at Gate B9 all evening, and it was somehow the loudest. Airport security escorted her toward the employee corridor. She turned once at the entrance to the concourse and looked back at the gate area, not at Walter, not at the cameras, and what she was looking for was not clear, but whatever it was, she did not find it in the faces looking back at her. She turned forward and walked through the door, and it closed behind her, and Gate B9 resumed. Kevin began boarding the flight. His hands were steady. The chairman's suite on a wide-body aircraft is a space designed for the particular kind of solitude that wealth can purchase, but cannot always deliver a private forward cabin with a door that closes fully, a window that looks out at nothing but cloud and dark, a flat bed that converts from a leather chair through a series of motor-driven adjustments that happen with the kind of smooth hydraulic precision that suggests someone spent a great deal of time and money on a problem that most people solve by reclining 3 inches. Solomon had been in it for 22 minutes before Walter knocked. He had not yet converted the chair to its flat configuration. He was sitting upright with his jacket folded over the armrest, his satchel on the floor beside him, and the altitude-thinned quiet of the forward cabin around him, like something physical, like the specific silence that descends after a long and difficult thing has ended and the body doesn't yet know what to do with the absence of difficulty. He was thinking about Mariana Vega's aorta. He was thinking about the keynote. He was thinking with the particular involuntary clarity that tired minds produce about every other time he had stood at a counter or in a lobby or at the entrance to a space and felt the specific friction of being assessed and found insufficient before anyone had looked at anything that actually mattered. Walter knocked once and waited. "Come in," Solomon said. Walter came in and sat on the ottoman across from Solomon's chair and set his duffel on the floor, and did not say anything immediately, which was one of the things Solomon was beginning to understand about Walter Gaines. He did not fill silence with talk. He used it the way careful people use margins as space to think in. "It's done on the ground," Walter said after a moment. "Vera's team is at the station manager's office. They have the servers. They'll have everything they need by morning." Solomon nodded. "Osley was detained in the Delta Lounge." Walter continued. "He had his phone. His phone has 3 years of cash transfer records and a text thread with Diane that my attorneys tell me will be the cleanest fraud case they've seen in a decade." Solomon looked out the window at the cloud cover below the city lights of the eastern seaboard fading behind them. "What about Greg Fallow?" "Fallow opened his door before they knocked," Walter said, "which tells me he's been expecting this for a while. He's already talking." "And Kevin," Solomon asked. "Kevin keeps his job," Walter said. "More than that. But that's a conversation for later." He settled back slightly, and the expression on his face shifted to something more personal, less operational, the look of a man who has been moving efficiently through consequences for the past 3 hours, and is now, for the first time, asking himself a more fundamental question. "I want to ask you something. And I want you to know I'm asking it genuinely, not as an exercise." "All right," Solomon said. "How did you stay so calm?" Walter asked. "Through all of it." "She was inventing reasons to deny you. She called security. She canceled a ticket you paid for. He stopped. "I've managed difficult situations for 35 years. I've been in contract negotiations that went 16 hours. I've sat across from regulators who were trying to ground my entire airline. And I don't know if I could have stood at that counter the way you stood there. I would have gotten loud. I would have made it worse." Solomon looked at Walter for a moment before he answered. When he did, his voice had the quality of someone saying something they have thought about many times, not because the thinking makes it easier to say, but because the repetition has clarified it. "The calm isn't strength," Solomon said. "I want to be clear about that because people hear calm, and they think it means unbothered. And I was bothered, I was deeply bothered. But if I had raised my voice at that counter, I would have become the story. Not what she did not, the canceled ticket, not the fabricated flag, not the 300 people before me, my anger, my aggression. She would have made one phone call and told a story that enough people would have believed because they were already primed to believe it. And I would have been escorted out of that terminal without a flight and without anyone's sympathy, and with a notation in my passenger file that would follow me." He paused. "My composure is not a virtue. It's a calculation. I calculated that the cost of reacting was higher than the cost of enduring, and I made that calculation in the first 30 seconds, and I held it for 30 minutes. And that I had to make that calculation at all in 2024, in an airport I've flown through 40 times, is the thing that I don't have words for that aren't words I don't want to use in public." Walter sat with this for a long time. "You shouldn't have to live like that," he said, and the statement had the weight of something he understood he was only now fully grasping rather than something he had always known. "No," Solomon agreed. "I shouldn't." The plane flew on through the dark above the Atlantic, and the two men sat across from each other in the particular quiet of a shared understanding that had been reached too late and had cost too much, and was nevertheless real. "I want to offer you something," Walter said. He opened his duffel and removed a cream-colored envelope. "Not as compensation. Not as silence money. I want you to know before I hand you this that you can tell this story to anyone you want. I hope you do, and it won't change what's in this envelope or whether it stands." Solomon looked at the envelope. "I want you to chair the Passenger Equity Council," Walter said. "It doesn't exist yet. It will exist because I'm going to build it. Full independent authority. You audit any gate, any station, any complaint record at any time without advance notice, and your findings go directly to the board, not through any operational layer that could slow them or alter them. Real power, not symbolic." Solomon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My conditions. Name them," Walter said. "The first order of business is a 5-year retroactive audit of every manual override logged at every Apex station," Solomon said. "Every affected passenger is identified and contacted. Every complaint that was closed without meaningful review is reopened. Done," Walter said. "The override system gets redesigned with a 2-agent verification requirement and automatic passenger notification," Solomon said. "No more other/undisclosed. If there is a reason, it is documented specifically transparently, and the passenger is told what it is." "Done," Walter said. "And Kevin Marsh chairs the operational subcommittee," Solomon said. "He spent 14 months watching and filing and getting nowhere, and he knows the inside of this problem better than anyone in the room." Walter smiled, a small, genuine, tired smile. "Done." Solomon took the envelope. He set it on the tray table beside him without opening it. "I'll read it when I've slept," he said. "Of course," Walter said. He stood, picked up his duffel, and paused at the door. "Thank you," he said. "Not for what you're going to do on the council, for what you said at the counter, about the architecture." Solomon had already closed his eyes. He was asleep before the plane leveled off. Marisol Cruz filed her piece at 11:47 p.m. from a hotel room in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood, sitting on the edge of the bed with her laptop open and her recorder playing back on the nightstand. The audio from Gate B9 filling the room with the specific quality of sound captured in a large, reverberant space. The flat tones of the gate area, Diane's voice at its various registers, Walter's quiet and carrying authority, Solomon's careful, precisely weighted sentences. She had been a journalist for 14 years. She had written pieces that won awards and pieces that were read by 40 people, and pieces that she knew in the writing were important even when she couldn't have said why. This one she knew was important in a different way, not because of the celebrity of the people involved. Though the CEO angle would drive traffic in ways she couldn't entirely control, but because it was a story about the ordinary machinery of a thing that most people experienced only from the inside of their own specific instance of it, without the broader context that made any individual instance legible. She wrote it in 3 hours. She wrote it the way you write something when all the material is already there, and the job is to structure it faithfully, rather than construct it cleverly with Vivian standing up in the 3rd paragraph with Kevin's face at the terminal in the middle section, with Solomon's statement about the calm and the calculation near the end, quoted exactly from the audio and used with his permission, which she had obtained via text message at 39,000 feet. The piece ran at midnight. By 2 a.m. it had been read by 200,000 people. By 6 a.m. the number was 4 million and climbing. The live stream, which Brandon had titled with the unglamorous specificity of someone who had not expected it to become anything crazy stuff at Atlanta Airport Gate B9, had been reclipped and redistributed across 11 platforms. The clip of Walter removing his Braves cap had become the primary unit of sharing 7 seconds, played 300 million times in 48 hours, the visual shorthand for something that took an hour to actually understand, but could be gestured at in the time it takes a face to change. The FAA sent a preliminary inquiry notice to Apex Airways at 7:15 a.m. 2 congressional offices issued statements before noon, not identical in their framing, but identical in their conclusion, which was that what had happened at Gate B9 was not an isolated incident requiring an isolated response, but a pattern requiring a structural one. The National Passenger Rights Initiative, a nonprofit that had been trying to get a congressional hearing on airline discrimination for 3 years, saw their petition signatures go from 40,000 to 890,000 in 18 hours and stopped counting. On the ground at Hartsfield-Jackson, Vera Okonkwo's team had worked through the night. The servers from the station manager's office contained everything Kevin had described, and considerably more, a spreadsheet maintained in a shared folder with a password that Fallow had apparently believed was secure cataloging every override transaction for 4 years, with columns for date, flight number, passenger name, seat number, and a dollar amount listed under a header that read accommodation fee, with the specific cheerful euphemism of someone who has decided that naming a thing incorrectly is the same as making it not exist. Garrett Osley's phone records obtained by court order at 4 a.m. contained a text thread with Diane that began 38 months ago with the phrase, "Let's talk about making your travel more consistent," and ended 6 days ago with a dollar amount and a flight number. Osley's attorney appeared at the federal building at 9 a.m. and requested a cooperation meeting before charges were formally filed, which is the particular speed at which people move when they understand that the evidence against them is comprehensive, and that being second to cooperate is significantly worse than being first. Greg Fallow had, as Walter predicted, begun talking before the corporate security team had fully explained why they were there. He talked for 6 hours. He named 4 additional gate agents at 3 other Apex stations who had been running variations of the same arrangement at smaller scale, all routing complaints through local station supervisors, who were participants rather than oversight. Kevin Marsh, who had not slept, was sitting in the break room at Gate B7 at 7 a.m. when Walter called him directly. The call lasted 4 minutes. Kevin was crying slightly by the end of it in the specific way of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time and is having difficulty processing its arrival. He wiped his face, straightened his uniform, and went back to his podium. Diane was processed through the Fulton County system overnight and released on bail at 6 a.m. She sat in her car in the county lot for 40 minutes before driving anywhere. And in that time she did not call Fallow, and she did not call her attorney, and she did not open any of the many messages on her phone. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the windshield, and thought about something Kevin had said at the terminal the previous evening when he was describing the complaints he had filed. I filed 2 of them. She had known about those complaints. She had known about all of them. She had believed each time that the closing of the complaint meant the complaint had been examined and found to be without merit. It had taken until 6 a.m. in a county parking lot for her to understand that she had confused the closing of a door with the clearing of an accusation, and that they were not the same thing, and that she had built 17 years of certainty on that confusion. It was a small and insufficient understanding, and it was also real, and it was the first real thing she had understood about herself in a very long time. The federal courtroom in Atlanta filled slowly on a Wednesday morning in late June, the summer heat pressing against the building's stone exterior, while the interior maintained the specific artificially cooled formality of a space designed to make clear that what happens here is separate from the ordinary temperature of life outside. Diane Caldwell entered through the side door with her attorney at 8:52, 8 minutes before proceedings began. She wore a gray blazer over a white blouse, not the severe navy of her uniform. Nothing that resembled a uniform, and her platinum hair had grown out significantly at the roots, the new growth soft and uncolored, so that her hair was now 2 colors. The artificial brightness she had maintained for years at the ends, and something closer to her actual self at the top. The combination had the quality of a transition in progress, a person caught between the version they performed and whatever they were becoming. She was alone at the defense table. Garrett Osley had pleaded guilty 8 weeks ago and was awaiting sentencing in a separate proceeding. Greg Fallow had pleaded guilty 6 weeks ago and had received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, which had been comprehensive enough that the prosecutor described it in the press briefing afterward as the kind of testimony that writes its own case. The 4 additional gate agents implicated by Fallow's cooperation had each resolved their cases individually, reduced charges, restitution agreements, terminations with cause in the preceding month. The machinery of the corruption they had participated in had been taken apart, piece by piece, each piece examined, documented, and disposed of. And the examination had produced the full picture of what Kevin's 14 months of watching had only partially revealed: a network that had processed approximately 412 fraudulent overrides across 5 stations, generating something over $300,000 in cash payments distributed among 8 people over 4 years, and resulting in 412 passengers whose travel plans had been disrupted for no legitimate reason. 412 letters had been sent. Each one contained a direct apology from Apex Airways signed by Walter Gaines personally. Each one contained a full refund of the affected ticket price plus a travel credit. And each one contained in the second paragraph an acknowledgement of what had actually happened. Not a processing error or a system irregularity, but the specific statement that the passenger's booking had been canceled deliberately and without cause by an airline employee, and that this was wrong, and that the airline was sorry. Solomon had insisted on the specific language. Walter had not objected. The Honorable Patricia Arroyo entered the courtroom at 9 a.m. with the economy of motion of someone who does not waste time on theater, and proceeded to business in the same manner. She was 61, a former civil rights attorney who had been on the federal bench for 12 years and was known among attorneys who appeared before her for the specific quality of her sentences, carefully proportioned, clearly reasoned, and disinclined toward either leniency that felt like mercy or harshness that felt like performance. She reviewed the plea agreement, confirmed that Diane understood its terms, and asked whether Diane had anything to say before sentencing. Diane stood. She had prepared something. She had worked on it with her attorney for 2 weeks, a careful construction designed to hit the notes of remorse without admitting anything beyond what had already been admitted, to convey accountability without offering anything that could be used in civil proceedings still pending. It was a competent document. She had read it to herself in her bathroom mirror every morning for 2 weeks. She did not read it. She stood at the defense table and looked at the judge, and then for a moment at the front row. Walter, in a dark suit, Solomon in his navy blazer and the same black turtleneck he had been wearing at Gate B 6 months ago, and she said something that was not in the prepared remarks. She said, "I knew." She let that sit for a moment. "I don't mean I knew Mr. Osley was paying me. The court has that in the record. I mean, I knew the moment I looked at Dr. Adeyemi and felt what I felt, that the feeling was wrong, not a mistake, not a misread. Wrong." Her voice was steady, which appeared to cost her something. "I've spent 6 months telling myself that I was doing my job, that I was trained to read passengers, that the protocol supported my decisions. But you can't train a feeling, and the feeling I had when he walked up to my counter was not about protocol." She paused. I looked at him and decided who he was before he had said a word, and every decision I made afterward was about protecting that first decision rather than correcting it. I know that now. I knew it then. I chose not to. Judge Arroyo was quiet for a moment after Diane sat down. The courtroom was very still. "Ms. Caldwell, Judge Arroyo said what you just said is the most honest thing in this proceeding, and I want to acknowledge it as such. I also want to be clear that honesty at sentencing, while it speaks to character, does not alter consequence." She opened the file before her. "You have pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of filing a false police report in a federal facility, and 1 count of conspiracy. The government has asked for 4 years. Diane's attorney sat up slightly. "I find that insufficient," Judge Arroyo said. The attorney's posture completed its adjustment. 412 passengers," Judge Arroyo continued. "That is not a clerical error. That is 4 years of deliberate choices made individually, each one a decision to take something from someone because you determined they could not effectively object. You didn't steal money in a conventional sense. You stole time, dignity, and the reasonable expectation that a transaction honestly completed would be honored. Those are not small things. She looked at Diane directly. And you called law enforcement on an innocent man in a federal facility and reported a weapon that did not exist. That particular choice could have ended someone's life. She closed the file. Diane Caldwell, I sentence you to 5.5 years in federal custody, followed by 2 years of supervised release. You will pay full restitution to all documented victims to be disbursed through the fund Apex Airways has established for this purpose. You are permanently barred from employment in any regulated transportation industry. The gavel fell not dramatically, just finitely. Court is adjourned. Diane did not make a sound. She stood when the bailiff indicated she should stand, and she placed her hands behind her back when indicated, and she walked toward the door with the specific quality of movement of someone who has finally and completely stopped performing anything. At the door she turned, not to look at Walter, not at the cameras, not at the attorneys, but at Solomon in the front row. She had spent 6 months imagining what she would want to see on his face if this moment ever happened. Satisfaction, vindication, the visible evidence that justice had landed where it was supposed to. What she saw instead was something she found harder to hold. He was not watching her departure with triumph or relief or the particular gleam of the ledger finally balanced. He was watching her the way he had watched her at the gate, with full attention and with something in his eyes that she could not name, but that felt in the brief second before she turned away like the complicated acknowledgement of one human being for another human being's failure. She turned forward. The door closed. The first meeting of the Apex Airways Passenger Equity Council convened on a Thursday morning in late July in a conference room on the 31st floor of the Apex headquarters building in Atlanta, where the floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a city that spread in every direction with the specific sprawling vitality of a place that has been growing faster than anyone has been able to fully plan, for which was Solomon thought not an entirely bad metaphor for the situation they were there to address. He sat at the head of the table, which felt strange to him, in the way that any chairmanship feels strange to a person who is more accustomed to being the best person in the room at one particular thing than to being the person responsible for the room itself. He had the 5-year override audit in front of him, bound in a folder that was thicker than he had expected, and thinner, Kevin had told him, than the full picture warranted, because the full picture required building the audit infrastructure to see it completely, which was itself one of the first things on the agenda. Around the table, 2 civil rights attorneys, one of whom had argued airline discrimination cases at the appellate level for 20 years, and brought to the room the particular precise anger of someone who has been building a case for 2 decades and is finally in a room with the people who could actually act on it. A former Department of Transportation investigator who had resigned in 2021 over what she described in her resignation letter as the department's structural disinclination to pursue pattern evidence in commercial aviation, discrimination complaints, and who had kept every file she was legally permitted to keep. A behavioral psychologist specializing in institutional bias, who had spent 15 years studying the mechanisms by which ordinary people in positions of minor authority make decisions that cause disproportionate harm to specific groups, and who had a theory about the design of incentive structures that she was eager to test against a live organization with the will to change, and Marisol Cruz, whose piece had been the instrument through which the public had understood what happened at Gate B9, and who was present not as a journalist. She had agreed to a formal recusal from covering Apex for the duration of her council liaison role, but as the council's independent transparency officer responsible for ensuring that the council's findings and the airline's responses to them were communicated publicly and accurately. Kevin Marsh was also there at the far end of the table with a legal pad and 3 pens and the expression of someone who is doing something they have wanted to do for a very long time and is not entirely sure yet how to hold the feeling of it. The three structural recommendations that emerged from the first meeting were not complicated, which was part of what made them significant. The most important changes to institutions are rarely technically complex. They are politically difficult, and the political difficulty is what causes them to be deferred until the cost of deferral becomes undeniable. The first recommendation eliminated the manual override system, entirely replacing it with a two-agent protocol that required documented specific cause and automatic passenger notification within 15 minutes of any booking modification. The passenger notification alone, the simple requirement that if your ticket was changed, you were told immediately and specifically why, was estimated to prevent approximately 90% of the fraudulent override activity the audit had documented, because the scheme depended entirely on passengers not knowing their tickets had been altered until they arrived at the gate. The second recommendation decoupled gate agent performance evaluations from incident-free metrics, the bonus structure that had been rewarding agents not for resolving complaints fairly, but for generating as few complaints as possible, which meant that suppression had been inadvertently or otherwise a financially incentivized behavior. The third recommendation, which generated the most internal resistance before Walter signed it, was a public-facing quarterly report complaint rates by route and station resolution outcomes and demographic breakdowns of who filed complaints and how those complaints were resolved. Transparency, not as a gesture but as a mechanism, the kind that changes behavior, because the people whose behavior needs to change know that what they do will be visible to people who can act on it. Walter signed all three into policy before the meeting ended. He also signed at the bottom of a separate document a promotion letter for Kevin Marsh, effective immediately, Station Supervisor, Atlanta B Concourse. He called Kevin directly rather than routing it through HR, and the call lasted 6 minutes, and Kevin did not cry this time, though it was a closer thing than he would have admitted. Before the meeting formally adjourned, Solomon asked the council's administrative coordinator to send a fruit basket to the pediatric ICU at Grady Memorial. No card, just a handwritten note for a patient in room 7, a girl named Mariana Vega, that said, "Your doctor says you can have orange juice now." Dr. Carrot concurs. The coordinator asked who Dr. Carrot was. "He'll know," Solomon said. 3 months after the council's first meeting on a Tuesday evening in October, when the Georgia heat had finally conceded to something approaching autumn, and the air outside Hartsfield-Jackson had the particular clarity of weather that has stopped trying to be, summer doctor Solomon Adeyemi walked through the B concourse of Terminal 1 with his leather satchel over one shoulder and his boarding pass in his hand, paper printed slightly creased from his jacket pocket. He had specifically requested Gate B9. The gate area looked the same, and did not look the same, and the difference was mostly in the smaller things. The velvet rope dividers were gone, replaced by a painted floor guide that was open enough that passengers in different boarding groups could stand in the same space without the division being enforced by furniture. The podium had been repositioned so that it was angled slightly outward toward the waiting area rather than creating a barrier between agent and passenger. And there was a small printed card affixed to the podium's facing edge that listed in plain language passengers' rights in the event of any booking modification, including the right to immediate written documentation of any change, and the right to escalate directly to a supervisor without requesting permission to do so. The gate agent on duty was a young woman named Deja, 23 years old and 8 months into her career at Apex Airways, who had joined after the reorganization and had been trained under the new protocols from her first day, and who therefore had no previous way of doing things to unlearn. She greeted Solomon by name. The system showed him as a council member and processed his boarding pass in under 2 minutes, with the easy, uncomplicated warmth of someone who has not yet learned to be otherwise, and with any luck, never would. Solomon sat in seat 2A. He had specifically requested it when booking and when the booking coordinator had asked if he wouldn't prefer the chairman's suite. He had standing access. Now he had said, no. 2A was the seat he wanted. The window seat in business. First, the seat he had paid for 6 weeks before a December evening that had turned into something neither he nor the airline, nor the 412 people who received letters had fully anticipated. He had a folder in his lap, the agenda for the council's next meeting. A copy of Marisol's follow-up piece published 3 months after the first cataloging the structural changes with the specific evidence-based accountability journalism that had made her reputation and that she brought to the transparency role with the same rigor, and a printed email from Rosa Vega Mariana's mother that he had read 4 times since receiving it the previous week, and that said in its 3rd paragraph that Mariana had told her pediatrician at her last checkup that she wanted to be a heart doctor when she grew up, like the one who fixed mine. The plane pushed back from Gate B9 at 7:04 p.m., 2 minutes ahead of schedule. His phone buzzed once on the tray table, a message from Walter Gaines, 3 words characteristically spare. Safe Travels Director. Solomon looked out the window as the aircraft turned onto the taxiway, and the terminal slid out of his line of sight, and the long lights of the runway came into view, parallel lines of white extending into the dark. The geometry of departure, the infrastructure of going somewhere. He thought about Diane's face at the courtroom door, and the thing he had seen there that she had not expected him to see, not the triumph she had been braced for, but the plain, difficult human recognition of 2 people who had been in the same room during something that neither of them would forget. He had not forgiven her. Forgiveness was its own process with its own timeline, and he was not going to perform it before it was real. But he had looked at her, and he had seen her, and that was something different from what she had done to him at the counter. It was the opposite of what she had done at the counter. And he thought that it mattered in some way he couldn't entirely articulate that he had done it anyway. The plane accelerated. The city fell away below in its vast illuminated grid, the hospitals and the highways and the neighborhoods and the airport at the center of it all. Processing 300,000 people a day through the machinery of going and arriving. The ordinary miracle of distance, made traversable. He watched the lights until they shrank into abstraction, and then disappeared entirely into the dark below the cloud cover, and the cabin settled into its altitude. And the forward suite's privacy door was closed, and Deja came through the curtain to ask if he'd like anything before they reached cruising altitude. He asked for water. He thought about the keynote he had given in Boston 6 months ago, and the one he was flying to give now, and how the thesis had not changed. But the weight of it had, the way a thing you have argued in the abstract for years acquires a different density when you have lived it specifically. He thought about the council's next agenda, and the second stage audit, and the 4 other airlines that had reached out to Marisol, asking whether the council model could be adapted for their own complaint infrastructure. He thought about a 7-year-old girl who wanted to be a heart doctor. He closed his eyes. The anger was still there. It had not gone anywhere, because real anger at real injustice does not simply resolve. It changes form, and the form it had taken in him was the kind that builds things rather than the kind that burns them. He was not less angry than he had been at Gate B9. He was more usefully angry, which was the only kind that changed anything. The plane leveled off at 35,000 feet. He slept. If this story moved you, if you believe that dignity is not an upgrade, that every passenger deserves to be seen as fully human, that one person standing their ground can change something larger than themselves, please like and subscribe to our channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it. The turbulence was real, the landing was earned, and somewhere above the clouds the work continues.